Imagine standing on the deck of a warship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, watching the United States Navy detonate an atomic bomb on purpose, less than a mile from where you're standing, aimed not at an enemy, but at its own fleet. Now imagine that inside that target fleet were landing craft and tank landing ships, the very same class of vessels that carried American troops onto the beaches of Normandy, Tarawa, and Okinawa. You've probably heard the story that after the war ended, the Navy simply had too many Higgins boats and LSTs lying around the Pacific, so it scuttled them by the hundreds to save money on shipping. That story sounds reasonable. It is also almost entirely wrong. The real reason the Navy sent landing ships to the bottom of a lagoon in the Marshall Islands has nothing to do with saving on freight costs, and everything to do with something far stranger, far more secretive, and far more dangerous. It involves a nuclear weapon, a cancelled test, and ships so radioactive that the Navy couldn't bring itself to scrap them for years. And by the time you understand what actually happened in those lagoons, you'll never look at a photograph of a beached landing craft the same way again. To understand why any of this happened, you first have to understand what the ocean looked like on the day Japan surrendered. In August of 1945, the United States Navy was the largest fleet the world had ever seen. Nearly 6,000 vessels flew American colors, from battleships and aircraft carriers down to the small, unglamorous workhorses of the amphibious war, the LCVPs, commonly called Higgins boats after their designer, Andrew Jackson Higgins of New Orleans, and the LSTs, the landing ships, tank, that could run themselves straight onto a beach and open their bow doors to disgorge tanks, trucks, and thousands of men. Higgins Industries alone had built more than 20,000 of these landing craft during the war, wooden-hulled, 36 feet long, designed to be cheap, fast, and expendable. The LSTs were bigger and built to last, over 300 feet of welded steel, engineered to survive a beaching that would have broken any conventional ship's keel. Together, these vessels had made possible nearly every amphibious assault of the Pacific War, from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima to the beaches of Okinawa in the spring of 1945. Without them, General Dwight Eisenhower himself admitted, the entire strategy of the war would have been different. These were not spare parts of the war effort. They were the machines that had made victory physically possible, and now, with the shooting over, nobody in Washington had any idea what to do with thousands of them. The surrender of Japan created a logistics crisis unlike anything the Navy had ever managed. On the day the Emperor's broadcast ended the war, roughly 1,000 ships were still steaming west across the Pacific, loaded with supplies for an invasion of the Japanese home islands that would now never happen. Depots on remote atolls held mountains of equipment nobody had time to inventory, because during the war, manpower had gone toward fighting, not paperwork. Now, practically overnight, the priorities of an entire hemisphere flipped. Millions of servicemen wanted to go home immediately. Factories that had been running 24 hours a day converting steel into landing craft and tanks shut down within weeks. And scattered across island chains from the Solomons to the Marshalls to the Marianas sat an ocean of surplus. Trucks, aircraft, guns, and landing craft that had cost a fortune to build and would cost another fortune to bring home. The Navy's own Bureau of Supplies and Accounts admitted in print the following year that the scale of the problem was almost impossible to describe, a surplus so enormous that no single agency could fully account for it. Some of it would be sold, some of it would be scrapped, some would be given away to allies rebuilding their own fleets, the way 6 surplus LSTs were handed over to the Royal Navy and eventually passed on again to Australia to help build a Pacific amphibious fleet almost from scratch. Congress had already passed the Surplus Property Act and would soon pass the Ship Sales Act of 1946, laws written specifically to unload an ocean's worth of steel onto private buyers, foreign governments, and scrap yards as fast as the paperwork could move. Records from individual vessels tell that story in miniature. LST-45, a veteran of the Marshall Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and the brutal Okinawa campaign, was decommissioned in late 1948 and sold to a tug and launch company in Seattle for conversion to civilian work. LST-494, which had carried troops onto the beaches on D-Day itself before finishing the war in the Pacific, was struck from the Navy list and sold to a buyer in the Philippines to be broken apart for scrap. These were the ordinary, unremarkable endings that met most of the fleet, one contract and one bill of sale at a time. But a small, strange fraction of that surplus fleet was about to be given a very different fate, one that had nothing to do with economics and everything to do with a weapon so new that nobody, not even the men who built it, fully understood what it could do to a navy. That decision began within weeks of the Japanese surrender, inside a debate most Americans never heard about. On August 25, 1945, barely 3 weeks after Hiroshima, a United States senator publicly floated an idea that sounded almost unbelievable: test the atomic bomb against a real fleet of ships to see exactly what it would do. The idea caught fire immediately inside the military. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, wrote directly to the Joint Chiefs of Staff that October, arguing that the Navy needed to understand, in concrete terms, whether the atomic bomb made the modern battleship obsolete overnight. The admirals who had just won the largest naval war in history were suddenly terrified that a single new weapon might have made every ship they commanded worthless. The Army wanted answers too, since some in the Air Forces were publicly arguing that battleships and carriers were now nothing more than expensive targets. So a joint Army-Navy task force was assembled, commanded by Vice Admiral William H.P. Blandy, with a singular mission: build a target fleet, detonate atomic weapons near it, and measure exactly what happens to warships, to amphibious vessels, to fuel, to ammunition, and to the sailors who might one day have to fight beside a nuclear blast. They needed a lagoon calm enough, remote enough, and large enough to hold nearly 100 ships at anchor. They chose an atoll in the Marshall Islands that few Americans had ever heard of. Its name was Bikini. And to fill out that target fleet, the Navy didn't reach for its newest battleships. It reached for the surplus: obsolete cruisers, captured German and Japanese warships, decommissioned submarines, and tucked in among them the ordinary, unglamorous landing ships and landing craft that had stormed 100 beaches and were now, in peacetime, worth almost nothing to anyone except as scientific data. Getting that fleet into position was its own logistical operation, almost a mirror image of the invasions those same ships had once taken part in. Task Force 1 assembled the target vessels from ports across the Pacific throughout the spring of 1946, towing dead-in-the-water hulks and sailing undercrewed ships thousands of miles to a lagoon most of their sailors had never heard of. Before a single bomb fell, the Navy relocated the entire native population of Bikini Atoll, 167 men, women, and children, who were told by a Navy Commodore that leaving their home temporarily would serve the good of all mankind. They were resettled on Rongerik Atoll, more than 100 miles away, with promises of an eventual return that would not be fulfilled for decades, if ever fully. By the summer of 1946, more than 90 vessels sat anchored in Bikini Lagoon, arranged at carefully measured distances from a single point in the water, like a bullseye built out of steel. Among them were LSTs, LCTs, or landing craft, tank, and other amphibious workhorses of the Pacific War, positioned specifically to answer a question nobody had ever been able to answer before. Would a flat-bottomed landing ship, built to survive running aground on an enemy beach, survive an atomic blast better or worse than a heavily armored battleship? On the 1st of July, 1946, a bomb nicknamed Gilda dropped from a B-29 and detonated 520 feet above the lagoon in a test codenamed Able. Several ships sank almost immediately. Many more survived, scarred and burned, but afloat. It was the second test that changed everything. On the 25th of July, a bomb called Helen of Bikini detonated 90 feet underwater, directly beneath the anchored fleet. The Baker shot, as it was known, sent a column of radioactive seawater more than a mile into the sky, and when that water rained back down onto the surviving ships, it didn't just damage them, it poisoned them. Every hull that had survived the blast was now soaked in radioactive fallout that clung to steel, seeped into paint, and settled into every crevice a mop or a hose could never fully reach. What happened next shocked even the men running the operation. The Navy had planned a third detonation, a deep underwater shot codenamed Charlie, scheduled for the following year. But when sailors were sent back aboard the contaminated target ships to prepare for that third test, something became terrifyingly clear. The radiation wasn't going away. Decontamination crews scrubbed decks with salt water, sand, and lye, and the Geiger counters barely moved. The Army colonel overseeing medical safety for the operation, Stafford Warren, eventually forced a halt to the entire cleanup, warning his superiors that the sailors scrubbing those decks were absorbing invisible doses of radiation with every hour they spent aboard, and that plutonium contamination in particular couldn't even be reliably detected with the equipment they had on hand. On August 10th, 1946, just weeks after the Baker shot, the Navy made a decision that never appeared in any newsreel. It quietly called off the third test entirely, and ordered the surviving fleet towed away from Bikini to a different lagoon, at Kwajalein Atoll, where the water, at least, wasn't glowing with fallout. That is where the real story of the landing ships begins, and it is nothing like the story you may have heard. This was not a case of the Navy dumping surplus equipment right after the war to save a few dollars on shipping. This was a fleet of ships that had just survived 2 atomic detonations, towed hundreds of miles to a second lagoon, where crews spent months trying to figure out what to do with vessels too radioactive to scrap and too dangerous to sail home. Of the surviving target ships, only a small number, roughly a dozen, were judged clean enough to be remanned by their own crews and sailed all the way back to the continental United States. A handful more were eventually scrapped once contamination levels dropped low enough for shipyard workers to handle them safely. But the majority of the amphibious vessels that had survived Operation Crossroads were never scrapped, never sold, and never brought home at all. They were simply sunk, on purpose, off the coast of the very atoll where they'd been towed to wait. LST-1108's sister ships and other landing ships in the target fleet were deliberately scuttled off Kwajalein across 1947 and into 1948, one at a time, sometimes years after the actual bomb tests had ended. Landing craft, tank vessels met the same fate on a rolling schedule stretched across those years. One scuttled in March of 1947, another in June, several more that September, their hulls slipping beneath the surface of a lagoon 8,000 miles from where they'd been built. This is where the story gets even stranger because the fate of the smaller landing craft and the larger LSTs actually diverged in a way almost nobody talks about. The Higgins boats, the small wooden-hulled LCVPs that most people picture when they hear the phrase landing craft, weren't part of the atomic target fleet at all. Their story was quieter, and in its own way, sadder. Because they were cheap to build and cost more to ship home than they were worth, thousands of them were simply sold off as civilian surplus for as little as $300 to $400 apiece, snapped up by fishermen, ranchers, and lakefront property owners who used them to haul lumber, cattle, and cargo up and down the Pacific coast for decades afterward. One of them, a genuine 7-battlestar combat veteran that had landed troops at Sicily, Tarawa, and Okinawa, ended up mysteriously sunk at the bottom of a reservoir in Northern California, only to be rediscovered by a diver more than 70 years later during a historic drought. Other wooden landing craft, judged too worn out even for civilian resale, were simply burned or bulldozed into island lagoons across the Pacific because there were no scrapyards for 1,000 miles and no reason to keep them. The same practical logic that led the military to push more than 100 aircraft into the waters of Kwajalein's own so-called airplane graveyard rather than pay to ship them home. Two completely different fates for two completely different vessels, both hiding behind the same misleading headline. The Higgins boats mostly met their end through neglect and economics. It was the larger landing ships, the LSTs and LCTs, that met their end through nuclear fire, quarantine, and a navy desperate to bury the evidence of just how contaminated its own fleet had become. The secrets buried in that story keep getting stranger the deeper you look. Before the Baker shot at Bikini, at least one LST in the target fleet was deliberately beached in shallow water rather than left floating, specifically so scientists could measure how a grounded amphibious vessel would handle the shockwave compared to a ship at anchor, information that would directly shape how the Navy designed future landing operations under the shadow of nuclear war. Some target vessels weren't sunk by the bombs at all, but were later finished off by naval gunfire, as crews aboard support ships used the irradiated hulks for target practice months after the actual detonations, a detail that rarely makes it into popular retellings of Crossroads. The radioactive water itself became such a serious hazard that sailors who reboarded the target ships after the Baker shot absorbed measurably higher doses of radiation than anyone stationed on the support vessels miles away, exposure levels that were only fully reconstructed decades later using computer models built from old film badge readings. And perhaps strangest of all, the very Marshall Islanders who called Bikini Atoll home had already been persuaded to leave their island months before the tests even began, told by a Navy Commodore that their sacrifice would benefit all of humanity, never fully informed that the lagoon they were leaving behind would still be considered too contaminated to safely inhabit for generations to come. Even the animals mattered to the story. Pigs and rats were tethered aboard several of the target ships during the tests, used as living stand-ins for human sailors, so doctors could study exactly what a nuclear blast and its radioactive aftermath would do to a living body still standing on a ship's deck. The legacy of what happened in that lagoon reaches much further than a handful of sunken landing ships. Operation Crossroads fundamentally rewrote how every navy on Earth thinks about surviving a nuclear age. The data gathered from those irradiated LSTs and LCTs shaped decades of naval architecture, influencing decisions about hull design, ship spacing information, and decontamination protocols that remain in use today. It also marked one of the first moments the American public began to grapple with the idea that radioactive contamination could linger on an object indefinitely, a lesson learned specifically because a fleet of ordinary landing craft came back from an atomic test too poisoned to touch. Today, the very same lagoon at Kwajalein where those landing ships were finally sent to rest has become an underwater time capsule, visited by divers who descend past coral-encrusted hulls that once carried American troops onto some of the most contested beaches in history, unaware, most of the time, that the ship beneath them didn't sink in battle at all, but was scuttled years after the war ended, in the shadow of a weapon that changed warfare forever. A handful of Higgins boats survived too, preserved in museums or, in one memorable case, hauled up from the bottom of a California lake, their hulls still bearing the faded serial numbers that once linked them to Patton's flagship and the invasion of Sicily. So the next time you hear someone claim the Navy scuttled hundreds of Higgins boats and LSTs off the Pacific Islands simply to save money after the war, you'll know the truth is far stranger and far more important than that. Some of those landing craft really did meet quiet, almost mundane ends, sold for the price of a used car, or simply left to rot because nobody wanted to pay for the trip home. But others were caught up in something far bigger than post-war cleanup. They became the guinea pigs of the atomic age, anchored in a lagoon while the United States detonated the most powerful weapons ever built, only to be towed away too radioactive to scrap, and quietly sent to the bottom of the sea years later, their true fate hidden behind a far more boring explanation that stuck around because nobody bothered to ask what really happened. What does it say about how we remember history, when the more convenient story survives and the truer stranger one sinks quietly to the bottom of a lagoon, waiting for someone to come looking? If this uncovered a piece of history you never knew existed, let me know in the comments which surplus mystery you want uncovered next, because there's another one waiting, and it's even harder to believe. Subscribe so you don't miss it.